So let's start talking about test administration. A lot of this stuff is very conceptual. We can go through it pretty quick. So I'm going to go rather quickly through stuff, but if you have questions and need me to reiterate or go on more into detail, let me know. All right. So test administration is an interesting idea. We usually think about tests sort of being their own thing, that, you know, you're given the back depression inventory, you take it, and we can look at, you know, your true level of depression versus the error, and that's sort of separating out the observed score to get on that test. And we usually, and this is how it gets talked about a lot, the observed score is true score plus error, and we tend to focus on separating out the true score and the error. And even in factor analysis, we talk about, let's try to identify the common variance that is related to the factor, and separate out the unique variance that's in each item that doesn't seem to be related to the factor. But we don't do much to try to identify the different components, what actually might be contributing to this error. We talked about it a little bit with reliability, that sometimes time contributes to error. Different item content can contribute to some of the error if you're looking at Chromebox Alpha or something. Different forms of the test can contribute to some of the error. But the actual administration of the test in and of itself can actually contribute to some error. So when tests are actually administered, a lot of tests are not just things you take on your own. Something like you know, the Wechsler or the Stanford Binet, you actually have to have someone administer the test. So think about even the achievement testing you did as you know, so junior high, high school, actually I think grade school, all through K through 12, they do some kind of testing. There's always, the teacher sort of has administered, like there's certain steps you got to take. Like I remember having to sort of break the seal on the test, and then you had to go to a certain page and it said, stop, do not go beyond this page. There was a certain, you know, certain steps you had to take. A lot of tests require people to follow very strict instructions about how the test is delivered. And the thing that, you know, so you've taken the SATs, that's an administered test. You have to go to a place to do it. They have to watch you. You got to follow certain steps. You have to do things in a certain way. Same thing if you've ever taken an AP test, same kind of thing. There's, it's an administered test, things like the MMPI, a lot of, intelligence tests all requires an administrator, somebody to actually give you the test and make sure that you follow all the steps. And any test that is administered like that, the actual administration of it can actually lead to some error. So when it comes to test administration, the things that actually seem to affect it some way or another, or at least have been tested to look for the effects of it, you have the rapport between the test taker and the test administrator. When we'll talk about it a little bit, but just being able to be friendly and sort of build a rapport with the person taking the test, especially something like an intelligence test, where there is some, you know, communication and there's stuff you have to have them do, and there's more interaction between the administrator and the person. The rapport that the administrator has with the test taker can have an impact. Things like ethnicity, you may think, oh, like, well, what does ethnicity do with administration? They've looked at, you know, certain types of tests where if the test is administered to a student of one ethnicity by an administrator of another ethnicity, there actually can be some impact there. And that comes back somewhat to the perceptions of the rapport with the administrator and stuff, but there is something about mismatch. And think about, in the extreme case, that something like interviewing or clinical interviews, that ethnicity, culture specifically, can actually contribute to misunderstandings, misinterpretations of things, and there can be some issues. And that then leads you to language, that because language, there's so many idioms and colloquialisms, all kinds of things, that even if you're speaking the same language, if the source, like where you're taught that language, is from different places, like someone, you know, they're both in English, but someone's from England versus the United States, there could be some misunderstandings and things that occur because of language. It gets even worse when you start talking about people taking having tests administered in a language that isn't their first language. And so there's issues there too, just in terms of understanding and comprehension and things. there needs to be some training of test administrators, so there's consistent sort of administration, and the scoring and everything becomes very standardized. There's these expectancy effects, which goes back to, you know, some other these things too, but it really comes back to like the Pygmalion effect, which if you've ever seen the movie like My Fair Lady or whatever, originally the movie or the story that movie is based on is called Pygmalion, and it's this idea that if you have certain expectancies about somebody, you're going to treat them in a way that may actually get a reaction from them. They may actually behave in a way that matches your expectancy, and you may do so completely without knowing you're doing it. So if someone comes in and for some reason you think that they are smart, you're told that they're smart, and you're giving them an intelligence test, it may, you know, things that you do and the way that you behave with them may actually elicit a higher response. So they've done these kinds of experiments, and I forget who, and I wish I remembered, but you know, where they've taken elementary school teachers and told them that certain kids were problem students and were very difficult to teach, and other kids that were like gifted, and really they were randomly selected. And at the end of the year, the gifted kids were performing much higher, and the kids that were problem kids were performing much lower, simply because the teacher interacted with them differently. Their expectancies changed. Use of reinforcers is a debatable thing when it comes to testing. Like, you know, do you reinforce people for taking the test? Meaning give them reinforcer things. You know, with kids, do you give them candy for completing parts of the test, or, you know, reinforce their behavior? So talk about the impact there. And then there's computer-assisted testing. Is what, you know, if you've taken a lot of any achievement tests or other things, a lot of them, SATs, GREs, MCATs, there's been different versions that have been done through, you do it through the computer. What that does is help to standardize the administration so that, you know, you take the human element, the human part out of it. And there's also some other reasons too we'll talk about, well, where the computer can actually be a much better way to do it, depending on the kind of information you're trying to gather. If it's something like achievements or something, it probably doesn't matter. But if it's something more personal, where you're asking about sexual history or things that are much more personal for a person responding to, it may actually be better to be done through a computer-assisted, where you sort of remove the human element out. You don't have a person asking you about those things. It's something you just sort of self-report. And then there's all kinds of subject variables that sort of that factor in here that we'll talk about as well. Rapport has been studied quite a bit, and I realized in these slides that some of these references are a bit on the older side. So I imagine if you look, there's more recent ones, but they've been trying to establish this for quite a while. The importance of establishing rapport between a test administrator or between an interviewer and interviewee has been long. You know, they've been studying probably longer than this, but they were looking at the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, and they found that they did some experiments where they did what they called enhanced rapport, where the person tried to build rapport and tried to, you know, to appear friendly and, you know, really build a connection with the test taker. And what they found is for really young kids, the enhanced rapport didn't really seem to do much. It didn't really seem to affect their ability. So meaning that the enhanced rapport didn't change the way they responded to the actual IQ test. But as kids got older, all of a sudden, if a test administrator actually was using sort of enhanced rapport, like they were actually trying to build rapport and not just be neutral, they were trying to be friendly and smile and stuff like that with the test taker, it actually led to an average sort of increase in IQ, which tells you a little bit something there, that sometimes students will do better simply by getting even the smallest little bit of encouragement or something like that from someone giving them the test. So the rapport can have a pretty big impact. Right? Going from an average of 109 to 122 is a pretty big jump, all just from using sort of enhanced rapport. Children score lower on IQ tests and the administrator made disapproving comments. Right? So the reverse is also true. This is a little bit older, but children unfamiliar with an administrator did significantly worse on a reading test compared to children familiar with the administrator. So if you have a stranger come in and administer a test in a classroom, students tend to do worse than if their teacher or someone they know is actually the one administering the test, which does lead to a little bit of some questions there about that, because is it because the student, like there's some third variable issues you can get in there. Is there something that the teacher is doing to sort of help them or to increase their scores? Is it just the familiarity, or is there are other things going on there too? This idea that there's been some claims that that even for SATs and other things, because not SATs, things like SBAC or STAR, these sort of achievement testing, because a lot of decisions about funding and all kinds of other stuff get decided based on test scores. Are the teachers doing things to sort of help their students succeed? And so that does bring that up. So is the reason why they're doing better is because just the familiarity, or is there other things going on that are sort of unknown? So is it going to be clear what a meta-analysis is? By the way, I should mention that before I get lost on the digression of these people's last names that are kind of funny. What a meta-analysis does is it looks across multiple studies that are studying the same or very similar things, outcomes. In this case, it's looking at IQ. And the reason for it, and the reason why meta-analyses have become more and more popular, is it makes a lot of sense, because think about type 1 error. The whole thing about statistics is we do these things based on probability. We do one study and we get a significant result. We just don't know with that one study if that result is real or if it was a product of a type 1 error, like a false positive. So if you look over multiple studies studying the same thing and you find a trend of finding these kinds of things to be significant, then that's even better. You can actually make some more solid sort of conclusions about what's going on. And a really good meta-analysis will go beyond that, and it'll try to find people that have done similar studies that weren't published because they weren't significant. Because there's this whole idea what they call the file drawer problem in research, which is if I do a study and it's significant, or if it confirms my hypothesis, then I get to publish it. I get to put it out there, other people read it. But if I do a study and it comes out to be not significant, it doesn't confirm, it goes opposite direction of my hypothesis, whatever, I'm not going to be able to publish it, right? So it just gets stuck in a file drawer somewhere. So for every, potentially for every study that someone finds a significant result, there's others that are likely they've done where the results weren't significant. So you're supposed to, with a meta-analysis, go and find these other studies, these other research studies that didn't find or didn't confirm things, that actually include that as part of this sort of holistic approach of looking at the problem. Now, with that being said, without going into a whole lot of detail, they looked over 22 studies involving something like almost, close to 1,500 children. And then they found a 4 IQ point increase when the examiner was familiar with the test taker in general, right? So if it's something where the kid knew that the test administrator, they actually scored a few points higher in IQ, sort of consistently. And if the kid happened to be from a lower SES group, then there was even a bigger jump. It was more like a 7.6 point increase if they were with a familiar test administrator and they're from a lower SES group, which is an interesting sort of combination. And I don't really have any hypotheses about why that would be, but it's an interesting finding to find out that the kids with lower SES actually get more of a boost from the familiarity of the test taker. So familiarity, and the reason why familiarity is sort of just in a simple way is that if it's something that you're familiar with, it's someone that you already have a certain level of rapport with, right? So if it's your teacher or something, there's already that there. The test administrator doesn't have to build that. It sort of already comes with the familiarity, which then people have seen actually that helps to increase people's test taking ability, or at least their ability to score higher. So importance of sort of establishing rapport. So if people like self-report versus interview of attitudinal surveys, I mean things about that people have, how they feel about things, their perceptions, their attitudes towards things. People disclose more on self-report than they do in interviews. Right, so if you actually give them a survey where they're able to take it by themselves without anybody asking them questions, and they're likely to be more honest, right? And people disclose more to computers than they do to human interviewers. So if you actually had I'm not sure how. I mean, imagine some kind of device where it's able to read off questions to you, and then you were able to respond, sort of like an interview, but it was a computer instead of an actual person. They actually are willing to disclose more to them because of that. The Hawthorne effect is where people change their behavior because they're being watched or being studied. So this idea that because a person's there, right, they're the one administering the test, the simple presence of another person may actually change the way people respond, change the way they behave. All right, so building rapport, making people feel comfortable, and make them feel like you're not judging them, or whatever process is important for that particular test is going to be important to establish, because it's been shown that people are just not very good at being honest and sort of forthright when it comes to responding to another human being. So the conclusions here, which is not really a super strong conclusion, because there's one that's a little bit old and there's probably more research needs to be done on it, I'm sure. Rapport is important in situations that are not viewed as personal. So, or those typical subject to social desirability. So with socially desirable and personal information, rapport can help maybe a little bit, but people are not going to be super honest. But when it comes to like achievement testing, aptitude, things that are not personal or socially desirable responses, then rapport can actually help people, can help enhance scores, or be detrimental to them if the rapport is actually bad, right? So it's interesting to think that the test administrator can actually affect the outcomes of something like an IQ test, which is interesting. So this is again the question, and this is a bigger question that comes down to sort of the cultural match. So this is true in interviewing. If you go see a counselor, there's all kinds of information that says, look, if you're seeking a counselor or psychiatrist, psychologist to go and talk to, you should seek out someone that is either of the same culture, or at least shares some cultural overlap, or something, or someone who has been trained to work with someone from your culture, so that they understand the sort of ins and outs of things that are culturally relevant to what you're talking about, and they can use the culture as a lens to understand the issues that you're having, behavior problems, that sort of thing, because they manifest sort of differently depending on the practices in different cultures. So coming from a sort of counseling, clinical psychology perspective, it's the same when it comes to test administration, that if there's some aspect of interaction between the administrator and the test taker, then the same rules should probably apply. There probably should be some overlap. The majority of studies have found some very non-significant effects for cross-ethnic administration of most intelligence tests. So this sort of seems to go against what I'm saying, that as test administrators are giving like the Wechsler or some other intelligence scale, they're not finding a whole lot of differences. The only significant findings have been with paraprofessionals, so people who aren't normally the test administrators, people who aren't clinicians, that they're not trained well enough to administer the test. Sometimes you get big differences. And the reason for this is, and why they put so much time into trying to standardize procedures, try to make the procedures for doing the test as standard as possible, is so that you're not getting a whole lot of variation when it comes to the test administration. So things like this shouldn't matter. But we just said a second ago that rapport matters. So rapport with this, between the test administrator and test taker matters regardless of the standardized procedures. So there's got to be something to it, and even to the sense that if someone's of the same ethnicity, you share some cultural overlap in terms of practices or other things, language, other things like that. It's likely going to be easier to establish rapport. Not easy, but easier. It may actually ease the process of building rapport with someone if you have, commonality. If you have something that actually you share that should make building rapport a little bit easier. So there, even though they may not have found a whole lot of significant differences, there's likely something there that just hasn't really been uncovered yet. The bigger thing when it comes to sort of ethnicity or culture and things that really starts to get involved with test administration has to do with language. So how valid are tests given in English to bilingual or limited English proficient individuals? So this is it's an interesting question that gets brought up often, but never really seems to be adequately addressed. That if you have students who are just picking on LAUSD, so you got students who are in Los Angeles Unified School District that when they come in, they end up being tested, and they come out as being sort of not proficient in English. So they're lacking proficiency in English, and it's likely because their home language is something else. Now, for the majority of in LUSD, it's likely Spanish, but there's lots of other languages too, where English is not their first language, and yet all of the SBAC and all the other testing type things are done in English. So is it possible, is it really valid to measure someone's achievement or aptitude in a language that isn't their native language or isn't their first language? So it becomes complicated. And so one solution is, well, why don't we just translate the test? Let's translate the test into the language, which I think there has been, there's some of that when it comes to testing. But the problem with translating is that translating anything from one language to another becomes complicated as well. If anybody's ever tried to translate between languages knows that trying to navigate both can be interesting, and there's certain things that just don't translate very well, or the connotation doesn't translate very well. So even that can be sort of complicated and make it so it's difficult to compare students who have taken a test, say in Spanish, and one is taken in English, and be able to compare them and see if they're sort of at the same achievement level. There's lots and lots of complications with that. So the standard practice comes down to, so let's administer a test in the most proficient language. So if you're bilingual and you're more proficient in Spanish than English, then take the test in Spanish. But then how do you sort of norm that out? That becomes complicated too. You need to have then a normative sample of people who are, Spanish-English bilinguals who are taking the test in Spanish to sort of see where they are. And especially when it comes to something like, aptitude is one, but even like something like depression or other things, how do you can't then norm it based on the same samples, so it just adds to complications here. And how comparable are scores from these individuals, and that's really what it comes down to. How do we make the test so that they're even in terms of, if I want to know if someone is proficient on the SBAC, that they have a high enough aptitude or achievement in, say, math. If on two different tests that are given two different languages, it may become very complicated to try to scale them in the same way. And there are ways, like it says, can IRT help? And a lot of it has gone to using more advanced procedures like item response theory to try to equate the tests, even when they actually may have different responses and different difficulties and stuff because of language issues. Things like IRT can actually help to alleviate some of that and match them up. So the answer is, it's complicated and becomes more problematic in terms of trying to match them and trying to keep everyone at the same time. But for the test taker, it's likely to help them improve their levels of achievement, their levels of aptitude and things, because they're able to take it in a language that they're more proficient in. Their comprehension is going to go up, and it's going to improve their scores. One of the things I just came from a meeting this morning, they were talking about trying to look at a different approach to looking at doing remediation of some sort, developmental math, developmental English, and that they call it stretch writing. These are classes designed for students who enter freshman year and they are not quite, they call it college ready, right? So they're lacking in some areas, whether it be math or writing or something, comprehension. And that lack there's a number of different reasons. They didn't receive the training in high school. It could be that they, because they entered into a system like LUSD sort of later, and their English development is just not caught up because Spanish or some other language is their first language. Lots of things sort of contribute to it, but they're not at the place where we want sort of freshmen to be when they're coming in. And the problem is, so did any of you take like English placement or math placement test when you first started at the university? So I bring this up. So you're saying you took both of those, and I think I ended up taking. I think I had to take a math placement, but I didn't have to take an English placement. And the reason why there are certain markers from high school often that will allow you to bypass taking these placement tests. So like in high school, I took an AP English course and I passed AP English. So not only did I not take a placement test, I never took like freshman English or any of that stuff. I had credit sort of starting. So if you've never taken a placement test, it's likely you scored high enough on your SAT, or you had grades that were high enough in certain courses that you didn't need to take a placement test. If you took a placement, and by the way, that doesn't mean if you took one that you didn't. Certain universities, maybe even community colleges, oftentimes will just ignore markers like that, and everyone takes a placement test. So don't think because you took one that meant there was something wrong with the high school. There's just different, every college has a different way of sort of approaching how to place students. And actually the big movement right now, especially in the CSU system, is the English and math placement tests have actually been eliminated. We don't do them anymore, starting like 2 years ago. And everything now is based on your they call it multiple measures, your high school indicators, things like SATs, grades in English or math courses, things like that. So we have done away with the placement tests altogether. The reason I bring this up is, and the reason why, because it's relevant to what we were talking about earlier, the thing that was in the back of my mind that bothered me about the way that English and math placement, just those two specifically, but it goes beyond that, is that it's done separately and sort of independently. So the way that you're judged on where you should be in math is done based solely on information about math courses, and about writing and language is based solely on that. And people have a very almost unyielding sort of view about how those skills are separate. Like people say, "Oh, I'm good at math, I'm not good at English," or vice versa. And they think it's sort of there's somehow these separate, independent skills. And there was a recent article, I think in Nature was the journal, where they looked at the things like coding, learning how to code, do computer coding, things like SQL or R or Python, those kinds of skills, that they're actually better predicted by your language ability than your math ability. And because if you think about coding as a language, you're learning some new languages and syntax and things about a new language, your language ability is going to be a better predictor. When most people tend to put coding and those kind of things into computer science and mathematics, and think you need to be good at math to be able to be good at something like coding. So it's interesting that these skills are a lot more interconnected than you might think. And just simply, if you're taking a test on math, you have to be able to read the questions, read the word problems, and understand what the problem is asking of you. So a student who is, say, an English learner, English second language student, who is taking a test in English, not only are they going to likely have an impact to their English comprehension sort of scores, but their math comprehension is likely to also take a hit, because if you can't fully understand the question or the problem that's being presented to you, you're not going to be able to answer it, at least not completely or appropriately, because you may be focusing on the wrong things, not understanding the problem. So the discussion I was having earlier today was, can we, get the folks that are around sort of math, the math instructors here on campus, the writing and sort of English language teachers on campus together, and figure out a way to approach the problem a little bit more holistically? Can we look at integrating the interventions that we have for math and English and be able to borrow from one another? So what are the writing teachers doing well that the math teachers can learn from? And it seems like this should be an obvious thing. But it isn't. These things are done very, very separately. Have you ever heard of the term silos? Silos is referring to sort of academia, that everybody works in their own silo. So if you know what a silo is, it's literally like a grain silo. It's like a cylindrical sort of building where like grains, it's like those kind of silos, or missile silos, that everyone sort of works in their own little world, and we oftentimes don't communicate with other people. So this group have folks represent the math department and there's a woman who represents Chicano studies who is actually the chair, like the writing council. So we're trying to get people together to talk about how can we use information about this, because language impacts sort of everything, right? Not just directly to language, but it's going to impact your math ability, your ability in sciences, and all kinds of stuff, and also your choice of career and the direction you go. Because if you feel like you can't do well because your language is limited, you're not going to go in certain areas in college or in career and all that kind of stuff later on. I mean, that was a long digression, but it's so sort of related to what we're talking about, what I was talking about earlier today, and I've been talking about for weeks, that I feel like I had to mention it to get some context. So just like translating tests is an issue, right? So if I translate a test over from English to another language or vice versa, using interpreters is also going to be a source, right? So if you ever, there's even movies sometimes where they'll sort of show this, where have someone say something in one language, it'll show you the subtitles, and then the translator will translate that in another language, and what they say is not what the person said. They'll actually sort of paraphrase or change the meaning, and sometimes it can lead to a lot of confusion, a lot of difficulties between people trying to communicate. So using an interpreter to translate between languages, that person can add to the error variability and be a source of error when trying to measure the test taker's actual true score and things. Yeah. Training is of vast importance. Not just training, but also retraining. There's a thing called drift that, even when you've been trained to do something, after a certain period of time of doing it, you need to be retrained so you can actually come back to where you're supposed to be, because people tend to drift and start to score a little differently over time. So administration and scoring errors are a large source of bias. So, and again, this is probably not something you think about, especially in the era of sort of computerized testing and things, but for many tests, like we do the upper division writing proficiency exam, students write, have to do some writing based on some prompts, and somebody has to sit and grade it. So just like the administration of a test can lead to more error, scoring also can too. So scoring errors are a large source of bias. Typically they have typical sort of graduate training. It's like 2 to 4 administrations of a test in class. That's about it. So they need to do more sort of on the job fieldwork training and stuff like that. Majority of testing practice obtained in fieldwork placements. So at some point somewhere, someone's coming out of some kind of training course on test administration, and they're doing it for the first time. They're doing it for the second time, and they really haven't gained the skills to really do it consistently, and they're actually adding error to the scoring of the test, or the administration of the test. The error rates on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale administrations decrease after 10 administrations. I have an exclamation point. Think about that. Someone needs to administer the waste 10 times to adequately sort of decrease the amount of errors that are due to just issues with administrating the test. So again, somewhere there's an administrator doing it for the first time, and that person could actually be skewing or screwing up your score, and your actual IQ may be not quite adequately captured by that. So this is not the Hawthorne effect where people change their behavior because they're being watched. This is going back to sort of that Pygmalion effect, where if I have certain expectations of you, my behavior will tip you off to what those expectations are, and that actually can change your behavior. So subjects perform in a manner consistent with the experimenter's expectations. This works with humans, it works with rats, it's worked with a number of different species they've sort of done this with, and the effects are not limited to experiments. It also occurs in standardized tests. Students asked to score ambiguous responses will give more points to people they like or think are bright, and people will find things that they expect. So one of the things that I typically do, and it's true of this course as well, is that when I go to grade, knowing that this is true, knowing that my own biases, even if I'm not aware of the bias, that I may score things differently because of who is who it is I'm scoring. If I like a student, I may inadvertently sort of score them easier or give them points for things. If I don't like them, I may end up being stricter or harsher on them. So I oftentimes will I make sure I grade anonymously. So I'll take in CCLE and Canvas and other places, you can actually turn off the information. It'll literally just say student 1. And I go through and and grade the exam, not knowing who people are, because I don't want this sort of type of effect to occur. So this occurs with test administration as well. If a test taker gets the feeling the person thinks they're bright or responds to them in a certain way, they actually may do better. And it could actually impact. And same is true the other way around. They're treated harshly or treated like they're dumb or something. They may end up doing worse on something like an aptitude or IQ test or something like that, just because of those expectancies. So Rosenthal, expectancy effects are triggered by nonverbal cues. So sometimes it's the things we say. So yeah, we're expecting that if a test administrator says, "Oh my God, that's a horrible answer," and they say very negative things, of course that's going to affect things. But it's not always just the verbal things. It's the nonverbal cues, and the administrator may not even be aware that they're sort of giving these cues off. And expectancy effects have small and varied influence on test outcomes. And a lot more studies being done, and probably will be done, on how these things sort of play out, because sometimes they can improve scores, sometimes they make them worse. So the other thing that happens sometimes is this idea of sort of using reinforcers or reinforcement for in testing, and this is also true in experimentation in lots of different ways. So a lot of times you'll get people look into the idea of using reinforcers and how that impacts sort of research generally. A lot of times you'll get these, you may get a link for a survey, and we do this working with different programs. We'll oftentimes send out surveys to a lot of people, and we know that people don't like taking surveys, right? I mean, surveys can be kind of a drag, and it's like a million things to do. I don't want to spend an hour answering a bunch of questions. But if we tell you that you'll get a $5 gift card or $20 gift card for your participation, it increases increases the response rates. Same thing here too, like you're talking about testing and test administration. If you use reinforcers to try to increase the response rates and that kind of stuff, it can have sort of both positive and negative effects. And sometimes it comes down to things like cognitive dissonance. If the payment is low enough, so here's $5 to spend an hour doing a thing. It's like you're not doing it for the $5, so you're actually going to spend more time and actually be careful and sort of answer questions. But if I offer you $50 for the same response, you'll likely attribute the fact you're doing it to the $50, and you may not take the survey as seriously. You'll just whatever, I'm just doing this to get done so I can get the $50, right? So there's different aspects of how reinforcement stuff can actually affect people's responses. Individual studies, however, are compelling. This is, again, a little bit, it's dated, 1978, found a 17.6 point increase in IQ scores when African American children were given culturally appropriate feedback by African American test administrators. This goes back to rapport and stuff, but the feedback is actually the reinforcer. Oh, that's a good job. Keep going, keep trying. Those kinds of things can be reinforcing, and it actually led to a pretty massive jump. Again, this is 1978. There's got to be more recent stuff. I need to update some of these things because this is getting super dated. But even far back as 1978, they were already finding these things to sort of be true. And I imagine there's been some movement to address some of it, but I doubt it's gone. I doubt it's not an issue anymore. So the general guidelines here is that reinforcers are good when you're rewarding the effort and not the answer. So if you praise someone for getting the right answer and this actually, by the way, this is true for more than just test taking. It's true with raising kids or anything, where if a kid does something and they get like an answer correct, they work really hard and they get an answer correct, you go, oh my God, great job, you got the correct answer. So focusing on reinforcing the answer is not going to do as well as focusing on reinforcing the effort they put in finding the answer. So if you say, oh my God, you know, I'm really proud you tried so hard, you stuck at it, those kinds of things are going to go a lot farther in reinforcing the behavior than focusing on just the correct answer. And really, it comes down to if you're the administrator of any test and you're thinking that you want to encourage or use reinforcement to get kids to do better, the first thing you should do is actually check the test manual first. Many of them are going to tell you not to do that because you're going to bias it. So, and this also goes to certain things like that you see sometimes too, where it's like in grade school or something, the teacher will be like, hey, you know, if everyone does well on the STAR aspect test on class, the class will have a pizza party. So this sort of expectation of reinforcement for the test could also be sort of harmful and maybe go against the testing manual as well. So what about computer-assisted administration? Lots of advantages here, right? Lots and lots of advantages of switching over to computers. And this is true for everything. I mean, everything's being computerized and automated because it does tend to eliminate all the human error that goes into being human and administering tests or anything, counting money as a bank teller. All these things have been replaced because computers tend to have a more precise, better handling of those kinds of things. So the obvious connection to item response theory here is not lost, because item response theory is the theory behind a lot of computer assisted or computer adaptive testing. The difference between computer assisted is just the test is on the computer, so it's done on the computer. Computer adaptive is the test is on the computer and the test actually adapts to you. So as you get questions correct, the questions get harder. As you make mistakes or get questions wrong, the questions get easier. It actually adapts to your ability level. That's a computer adaptive. So we're not necessarily talking about computer adaptive, but we're talking about computer assisted. You can actually make them highly standardized, right? So the process becomes very, very, very rigorously similar across all administrations because the computer is sort of doing it. It's all been done that way. You can actually make the timing sort of precise. So instead of having someone with a stopwatch making sure that everyone stops, and then when you say stop, some kids continue going. You're like, hey, close your book, and they keep doing. And you got to go over there and make them. So those things sort of change the precision of timing and the sort of standardization of how much time students get. It lessens the dependence on human testers, which is what we're talking about. It sort of standardizes the pacing of everything. And so, the response doesn't have to be rushed by a test administrator or whatever. It's just going to be a standardized sort of process through the timing of the test. And you can sort of control for some of the biases. You can get rid of the test administrator biases. You can make sure that that no one's using reinforcement. You can make sure that rapport is not part of the deal. You can make sure that all those things sort of get eliminated and makes everything sort of standardized. Computer adaptive versions of tests have shown no large differences between the computer assisted and paper pencil versions, meaning that like when they decided to switch over. So there seems to be some switching around a little bit. Like when I took the SATs forever ago, it was paper pencil. I thought for a while it was then done through the computer. So how many of you took the SAT and or the ACT, and did you take it on a computer or was it paper pencil? Yeah, I have a feeling there was a weird thing where they had gone to sort of more computer adaptive and then sort of came back and switched it to being paper pencil again. But like when I took the graduate record exam, the GRE, it was computer adaptive. And I think even that may be switching back, but I'm not 100%. They actually, I think, maybe getting rid of that altogether. But anyway, so they've compared the paper pencil administrations versus the computer assisted. These are not like computer adaptive, but computer assisted, and found that there was really no difference. That it wasn't like one had an advantage over the other. Computer versions can be more accurate and take less time. So for instance, if you're doing a computer adaptive test, you can actually get to the same precision the same level of predictive precision as someone's ability with a much shorter test, because the test is adapting to you. It's picking questions that it is at your ability level, and it's going to keep increasing that until you make a mistake. So you can actually get by with a lot shorter questionnaires. You don't have to do this massively long questionnaires or surveys or aptitude tests or achievement tests. Some people enjoy the computer format and even prefer it, especially with more and more people sort of just being used to computers and doing everything on computer. I mean, I hardly ever handwrite anything anymore. When I do, I feel like it's some long lost talent. I'm like, how do I do that again? I forget how to write with my hand anymore. So I think we're going to see a lot more of these sort of computer assisted. Actually, I think in reality, what we're going to see is that you're going to do a lot of these sort of tests are going to start being, they're going to start doing away with a lot of them, especially like GREs, SATs, and things, because they're just not very good at doing what they're supposed to do. But for those that stick around, they're going to be a lot more computer assisted, and I would imagine more computer adapted. But I thought we would be farther along at this point. So 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would have thought by now it would all been computer adaptive, and because we're not, I'm a little bit confused. But we'll see. One study, again, a little bit old, Locke and Gilbert, showed that when respondents are asked about sensitive material, like the MMPI, there are questions about drinking and drug use and other things like that. They were more honest when the tests were administered via computer than via questionnaire or interview, which is what we said before. Computer adaptive tests have been applied to MMPI. They use them in personnel selection, cognitive tests. They've done it with the GRE, they've done it with all kinds of things where it actually makes a lot more sense to have the test adapt to your ability than it is to give everyone the same questions, and you're answering questions that are way too easy, some questions that are way too hard, and just to hone in on the ones that are right about at your level. The big concern with computer-aided testing is that it will lead to the computer-generated reports landing in the wrong hands. I don't know if this is the biggest concern, but the more automated the process gets, the more sort of online and sort of hackable the process becomes. Then if you're taking a cognitive battery or something like that and it gets out there, you may lose a job because you have a cognitive impairment, or if you're diagnosed with something like schizophrenia based on some kind of computer adaptive test and that gets out there. So these are sensitive materials that in a lot of ways should be treated in the same way that medical information is treated. So it would be treated under like HIPAA or something. And so the more that this goes into computer adaptive, the more people start to freak out about it, being out there in sort of the ether and people being able to get a hold of it. So other subject variables that affect things, these are all other things that contribute to the error in a test, but also can affect it's sometimes the test administration, but really more just their ability to perform well on a test. So this is not perfectly within the test administration part, but more the test taking part, the other side of it. The state of subject can also be a source of error when administering a test. Things like illness, insomnia, test anxiety, drugs, whether they're prescription drugs or recreational drugs. For instance, like if someone is, has ADD or something, and taking the aptitude test or something on something like Adderall or Ritalin, they're likely to do better than without it. Vice versa. There's even been this gets a little bit nuts, but they even looked at sort of hormone cycles and looked at that things like perceptual motor skills can vary depending on the cycle that a woman is in, on a menstrual cycle. It really can affect the way that they respond to tests. And some of this, like, there's research on this, it's a little bit dated, and sometimes I wonder if it's just a bunch of bullshit. I'm not sure, not because I think that there isn't issues here, but that the tie together to sort of hormones and other things has been misused, I think, quite a lot, trying to explain away, going back as far as like hysteria and all these other things. So I sometimes read these sort of things with caution, because it's like, was it done with any serious scientific rigor to really tie this? So I had a student not that long ago, actually it's been quite a while now, I guess, who was interested in looking at the effects of things like birth control and the hormones in them on people with borderline personality disorder, and that there are peaks in episodes with borderline personality related to hormones. And she had found all this research to support it and all this stuff, and we really couldn't replicate it. We really couldn't find any link to it. And you come to find out, you look into the research methodology, a lot of these things, they're done very correlationally and not done in any way that links the two together very strongly. And I think it's oftentimes those things get misused. But what they're claiming, and I don't have the reference here, I could find it if you're interested in it, but variations in perceptual and motor coordination varied with cycles. So the farther away the woman was from having her period, the less effect it was, and the effects, that would get more the closer she got. I don't know. I'm not sure how much weight I put into that, but it's definitely possible, and I know women have reported changes in all kinds of things around their cycle, so it's very possible this is true too. But the interesting thing about this, as a weird story to segue away from talking about menstruation, is that by the way, I'm acutely aware that I'm talking about, I'm a guy talking to a bunch of women about menstruation. It's just very strange. So I thought I'm going to move away from it. I can give you an example of this, just as a personal example of sort of how subject variables can affect things. So going back, the first time I took the GRE, I didn't take any courses or study for it. I sort of wanted to go and see how I would do just taking it on my own. Except the closer I got to the GRE, the more I started to sort of panic that I wasn't going to do well enough. So I started to do a little bit of self-study, and that became sort of obsessive. I started doing more and more, to the point where, like, the day before I was going to test, I was like, just spending all day long just sort of cramming stuff in, trying to figure out how to do the testing, to the point where I ended up going to bed super late, waking up super early because I had to drive like to Glendale or something to take the test. Long story short, in the middle of one of the sections, verbal, math, and at that point it was analytical, I actually fell asleep during the GRE. I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna put my head down for a second. Woke up like a half hour later in the middle of the GRE. So I don't recommend doing that. That's not a good testing approach, is to sort of fall asleep during the GRE. But it definitely had an impact on the score, because I wasn't able to, I don't think I even finished that section because I had slept through part of it. So I ended up having to retake it again. And then at that point, it was a couple years later. And I went to one of I think it was Princeton. No, it wasn't Princeton, it was the other one. I went to a Kaplan course on sort of the test taking, and that's where I learned a lot about if you're taking a computer adaptive version of a test, the way you take the test actually is a little bit different, and they give you different tips about sort of focusing on the first third of the test and less time on the last third, and all kinds of stuff, because of the way in which it adapts. So that's why I saw like insomnia. It wasn't really insomnia, but it was lack of sleep that totally screwed me up. Test anxiety is a big one, and I see this quite a lot. People are like, oh, I'm just not good at tests, or I have a lot of test anxiety. And I, as I acknowledge that that's a thing, and people really freak out about tests. But a lot of that stems from they also avoid them, right? So, like, if you're someone who has test anxiety, you oftentimes will avoid tests. You don't want to take them. You will go out of your way to sort of avoid having to be tested. And you would actually help to address and reduce your test anxiety if you actually did more, even just little tests, like little, and you sort of learn to sort of undo the anxiety that sort of comes with test taking. Because I get a lot of it because, I have students in stats courses, and they'll come to office hours and be like, I don't like math. I have math anxiety and test anxiety, and I don't know, what to do, and to avoid getting a negative grade because of it. And my advice is always like, well, you need to practice and make sure you're really like overly prepared And that's one of the only ways you're going to help sort of reduce the anxiety somewhat. And even then, it might still be there. But if it's overwhelming to the point where you can't do a test because you're having a panic attack, that sort of goes beyond, and you may have to go. I would, go and talk to a counselor or something, see if you can't figure out the roots there and sort of figure it out. But so things like anxiety and just the inner sort of workings of people can have a pretty big impact on exactly how well they can do on a test, especially if it's something they think is going to impact the rest of their lives, like the SAT or the LSAT or MCAT or GRE or whatever, right? So there's a lot hanging on these tests, and it can really, really start to affect you. So here we have factors affecting behavioral assessments. So this is still sort of test administration, sort of. It's still, we're talking about, doing behavioral assessment stuff like observational stuff. So issues arise that when people like judges, right, act as testing instruments. So we're not talking about test administrators, but these are people as the instruments of the testing, right? Human judges are subject to problems that add to the error when assessing respondents. People are horrible instruments. People are not consistent. They're not very accurate most of the time. You can train them. You can get them better. You can reduce some of the error, but in general, not super good. So there's all kinds of things like reactivity. Reactivity is, if you're watching someone's behavior, you may actually react to the way that to what they're doing, and it may affect the way in which it may affect your subjectivity. You may actually become angry, whatever. Think about it like out in the wild. You're supposed to be a wildlife videographer, and you see a zebra getting attacked by a lion, and you become angry. You lose your ability to be be objective, makes you more subjective. You lose your objectivity when you start to become emotionally sort of reactive to some of the things that are going on. So that's one of the issues. People tend to get emotionally involved in things. There's drift. So if you train someone to look for things and be able to score things and be an instrument, the more they do it, they will start to move away from their training and start to code things incorrectly. They'll sort of drift away, start to code things that don't exist, start to code things that, or miss things that should be coded, and they sort of drift away. Their expectations, the expectations they have about the respondents or about the targets they're watching is going to lead them to notice things that match their expectations and ignore things that don't match and all that kind of stuff. And people in general are motivated towards deception. So if someone's doing a behavioral assessment or whatever, and it's something that may reflect negatively on the actor, on the person being assessed, they're going to be motivated to try to hide those behavioral traits or to do things that will deceive the administrator, because that's protective of them, right? And judges oftentimes are not very good at being able to tell deception from reality. They're not, people are pretty poor deception, detectors. With some training can help. There are things like, lie detectors and other things that will help, but they're still not infallible, and they're not even admissible in court because there are so many issues with it. We talked about this earlier, right? The reliability of behavioral assessments is usually do something like the Cohen's kappa or something, where you're looking at integrated reliability, the controls for random agreement between people. Reliability tends to be highest when the judges know they're being evaluated. Meaning that, so this gets a little bit meta, right? So if I'm a judge and I'm watching targets, respondents, looking for behavioral things, right, and trying to code those, if I know that I'm being supervised, watched by someone else, someone is watching me judge the respondents, then I'm likely to be more accurate. I'm going to pay more attention. I'm going to have less drift. So integrated reliability tends to be higher when the judges know that they're being supervised. They know there's someone's watching them to make sure that they're doing it correctly. So even just having them come in and do periodic checks and things like that will help to keep their integrated reliability higher. This is part of that sort of reactivity. So before I was talking about that, people can get emotionally invested and sort of change the way that they view the targets because of this reactivity. But it's also true too that if you know your supervisor is watching you and you tune in more and you actually do a better job of watching, where you're reacting to that scenario, sort of like the Hawthorne effect on you. You're changing your behavior knowing you're being watched, which is increasing the accuracy, the reliability of your assessment, which in turn is a sort of form of reactivity. One study showed that the reliability of observers' rating decreased 25% when they were told that they would not be compared to a standard. So knowing that they weren't going to be compared to something, there wasn't a standard they're going to be compared to, they sort of didn't do as good a job. They weren't motivated. There was a change in their sort of reactivity. They changed the way in which they actually assessed the behaviors because they knew there wasn't going to be a there wasn't going to be a negative outcome because they weren't going to be checked against a standard. Many studies report inter-rater reliability, but care should be exercised because these numbers typically are calculated during training and drop during the administration. So what does that mean? So we have judges go through training and we say, okay, we trained them and we got them to a point where they're at like 0.85 or 0.9 reliability. Cool. Then they went and did the study, and they don't actually measure their inter-rater reliability during the study. And we know that when there's no trainer there's no supervisor, we know that their inter-rater reliability tends to drop and it tends to be drift. And if people are drifting in different ways, it's going to lower their reliability. So they should really report what the inter-rater reliability was during the actual test and not just during training. So drift is evaluators, judges, observers are typically trained and given a strict set of rules. All right, so there's a rubric of some sort. You're gonna look for these kinds of behaviors. Here's what we're assessing. Here's how you're gonna mark this down. Here's how to do it. After some time, the evaluators, the judges, may not be following as strict set of guidelines as they were trained to follow. So they start to get a little bit lax about how they are looking for it. They may not be as diligent in finding every behavior. They start to get expectations about things because the more people they see, the more like, oh, okay, this person's now they're going to do this, and they start to get accustomed to what they're looking for, and they may move away from really accurately identifying everything. To avoid this, they have to be the user's supposed to go through so when you first are trained, they call that the calibration period. You're being calibrated on a rubric, on some kind of assessment. After a certain period of time, depending on what it is and how complicated it is, you're supposed to recalibrate. So judges are supposed to go through a recalibration period where they're retrained to make sure that they're applying it the same way they used to and to avoid drift. That's what the retraining is called, this sort of recalibration. How do you assess someone who doesn't want to be accurately assessed? This is problematic. If you're in the FBI or a detective or something like that, you're trying to get answers, honest answers to things from people and assess their behaviors and their motivations and all kinds of stuff. But most of them, especially if they're guilty or for some reason or other, are trying to hide that that true information. So how do we go about doing that? How do we, there's all these people that talk about, the FBI or police being trained in the art of sort of deception, detection, and all that stuff. Secret Service agents only scored above chance. So it's 1991, so maybe they're better now than then, but still, compared to your average person, Secret Service just does slightly better. Which is not good. There's even, there's a whole industry behind lie detection. There's people who they run those sort of lie detector machines, and those are questionable at best, and it can work, but there's so many ways to sort of fool those machines that are readily known that lie detectors aren't admissible. There are commercial tests to look at honesty and integrity. But they often have questionable validity, and often are measuring other types of things, and it gets all muddied together. So you could get an idea of how honest a person is in general, but you don't know if they're being honest right now. when you're asking them questions about stuff. This applies in lots of different ways. I'm doing it as sort of a legal thing, but let's say you're someone who's having issues, and you have someone in your family who wants you to be committed because you're clinically depressed or whatever. You're going to be assessed by people who are going to judge your sort of mental fitness to take care of yourself, or to be put away in a mental hospital or something like that to be treated. You're likely going to be motivated to deceive them, try to fake good. So fake good is this idea of I want to make myself look better than I actually am, to look not as sick or not as like I don't have as many problems. There's also faking bad. So think about if you work for someone like a company, like Workman's Comp or something, where you're an insurance company or whatever that are covering people who are on disability. There's lots of people there that are going to fake bad, right? So they're saying they have an injured back. They're saying all kinds of things, and you're trying to assess whether or not they're actually telling the truth. That becomes hard. That's where the sort of deception detection can be sort of tricky. Again, people oftentimes, there's all these tricks people talk about. Well, if they look up the other line, there's all these, things that people try to look at. Slight changes in pupil dilation, all kinds of crazy stuff that people claim to be, to be good at detecting those things. But when it comes down to it, oftentimes they're maybe just slightly better than guessing, if better at all.